May I begin? Can you hear me?
Yes.
May I begin by making a confession? And my confession is that I am not, underlined, not a specialist on Rome and India. So why am I giving this lecture? It's the enthusiasm with which Andrea invited me, his insistence that I should do it, and now that I'm doing it, let me say it is entirely out of a concern for our friendship rather than any academic reason that brings me to this auditorium to give this lecture. So please bear that in mind. Before I go into the details of Rome and India, I'd like to make 3 points which I'd like you to keep as a kind of background to what both Naman and I are going to say. We haven't really discussed what either of us are going to say in any detail, so it's all a big surprise to me. The 3 points. One is the question of boundaries. Please do not think that in the pre-modern world we had boundaries like we have them today. They're not red lines across a map where somebody sits and insists that this happened on this side and that happened on that side, and the twain never met or were not encouraged to meet. Actually, boundaries were the reverse, which is why I prefer not to call them boundaries, but frontier zones in the pre-modern period, because they were geographical features. There was a mountain, there was a sea, there was a desert, there was a river, and something happened on this side and something happened on that side, but there was a lot of crossing, even through deserts. Some of the most carefully mapped routes are routes that go through deserts, and of course sea navigation, as you know, is very well attested to. So remember that frontier zones are not boundaries. We're talking about frontier zones. They are areas where people from all over come together. They are areas of what one could call acculturation. The people coming together are talking to each other, and that raises the issue of language. What was the language? The Greeks in Bactria coming down into northwestern India, what was the language they were speaking in? Prakrit, Greek, or some other language? We don't know. I mean, this is something we have to keep in mind. They weren't like us today, picking up a phone and talking to each other in a commonly known language. So lingualism, bilingualism, multilingualism is a very important component of all this toing and froing and crossing boundaries and frontiers. Patterns of living. Why do you marry your mama's daughter, your uncle's daughter, your mother's brother's daughter? We don't. There's a difference there, something there that matters. And again, please keep that in mind. There are different customs, there are different patterns of living that are coming together in all this crisscrossing that's going on. And thirdly, very, very important, or secondly, migration. Remember that frontier zones are always zones of attraction, and they attract migrant groups. So you've had Central Asia with its pastoralists and its herds of animals migrating all over the place, coming down, for example, into northwestern India, northeastern Iran, north of the Caspian Sea, into Eastern Europe, so on. You have migrations going on up and down the Persian Gulf. You have migrations going on between India and Egypt in coordination with the trade that's going on. Migrations are very important, and there is a difference which unfortunately the Indian social media does not make. There is a world of difference between migration and invasion. It's not the same thing at all. Invasions are small, sudden. There are large groups of people that go into an area, blow it up, destroy it, kill people, and so on, and declare victory over that area. Migrations are usually slow, scattered groups of people with their animals coming, settling, then getting up and moving into the next settlement, and so on. It's a different process altogether. And the difference in the process is that migration is essentially accompanied by acculturation. This is terribly important, and it's something people frequently mistake. Of course, there are obstacles to people migrating. There are obstacles, there are boundaries. You have Hadrian's Wall that separated Scotland from England, and it's a moot point as to whether in fact there was an obstacle between the Scottish way of life and the English way of life. And there is, of course, the Great Wall of China, which it's a strange experience that I had, climbing up and onto the wall and walking along it and thinking there were nomads on that side and there was the great Chinese civilization on this side. Who was defending who against what? That's another question that I won't go into. Anyway, so do remember that this is a very relative kind of thing that happens with boundaries. Then there is the extension of geography. We begin our earliest evidence of the Harappans is that they're sitting in the Indus Valley. We don't have a fuller map of this part of Asia, do we?
Not in
All right, they're sitting in the Indus Valley. They're in touch with the Mesopotamians who are sitting in...
They're there.
That's right. They're in the Indus Valley. They are in touch with the Mesopotamians who are in the Baghdad area, across overland and by sea along the Persian Gulf. That's one geography. 1,000 years later, it's expanded enormously because the people sitting in the Indus Valley have come down and are into southern Arabia and are down to the Red Sea. The Red Sea takes them to Egypt and to the eastern Mediterranean. And there is a whole new area of West Asia that has come into the story. And then as you go along with trade and invasion, I mean, Alexander's campaign was not a trading venture by any means, but very often what does happen with invasions is that they open up the possibilities of trade, which is of course what happened in this case here. But you had therefore, when one talks about routes and talks about communication, remember that there are two kinds of communication current in what we're going to be looking at. Overland, across India, Persia, and into the eastern Mediterranean, and by sea, the Persian Gulf, and much more from Osiris across the Arabian Sea, up the Red Sea to Egypt, Alexandria, and then to Rome. Now, judging by what I've been talking about, we are not talking about pure land routes only or maritime routes only. Routes can be mixed up. There are vast cargoes that are carried partly overland, partly by sea, then again overland, then again by sea. It's in fact a very complex business, and trade today, for example, is a much easier proposition than it was then. To move on to what we're discussing in greater detail this evening, Roman interest grows essentially from Hellenistic interests. What do I mean by this? You've got the Greeks sitting in Greece and in Asia Minor, as it was called, the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean. So they have little kingdoms. Alexander comes along and campaigns through that whole area across Persia across what is present-day Iraq and then Persia, onto Iran, onto the Indus Valley. Alexander stops, he crosses the Indus, goes to the Punjab and stops. And the theory is that his troops revolted and said, we don't want to carry on any further. And some of us think that maybe it was not that so much as the fact that Greek geographers had said to Alexander that once you get to the Indus and a little beyond, east of the Indus, the world comes to an end. You drop off the world on the other side. So Alexander may have thought, well, if I carry on like this, I'll drop off the world. And the best to call it a day. And the troops being agitated, he readily agreed to their agitation, came down the Indus and back to Babylon. This is all happening towards the latter part of the first millennium BC, the 4th century BC. And do remember that what we're going to be talking about, Naman and I, is taking place in a rather limited period of about 500 years. It's the end of the first millennium, the beginning of the second millennium, going on a couple of centuries into the second millennium. But it's a fairly compact period of time. The initial interest then of Alexander and post-Alexander, immediately post-Alexander, is political and diplomatic. The Mauryas fight against the Seleucids, which is a kingdom in Persia which has been set up by one of the generals of Alexander, who starts a dynasty known as the Seleucids. There's a treaty between Chandragupta and Seleucus where eastern Afghanistan is ceded to the Mauryas, and this becomes a very substantial slice of territory, enables us to call the Mauryas an empire. And interestingly, there's an epigamia. And it's not very clear, but there is a kind of free-for-all. Greeks can marry Indians, irrespective of, whether it is your mother's brother's daughter or not. Intermarriage is permitted. Now, this, I think, is a very important issue on the question of acculturation. Marriage is crucial to acculturation. It's crucial to acculturation when migration takes place, incidentally when invasions take place, and certainly when two cultures come together. The first thing they do is to rush to marry. And we have this very, very interesting category referred to in the Vedic texts, the Dasi Putraha Brahmana. The Brahman who is the son of a Dasi, the Dasi being the opposite of the Arya, being a lower caste person. Who are these people? How are they Brahmins? You search me and search them. This is a process of acculturation and very important. The frontier zones in this territory as it emerges and includes the bigger section, the Indus Valley from the northern point, the upper Indus all the way down to the Tana Delta, is a zone where people are crisscrossing all the time. And it's changing hands, and one day it belongs to the Mauryas, and one day it belongs to the Seleucids, and so on. So there's a lot of what emerges as what we call the Hellenistic kingdoms. They're not pure Greek kingdoms. They are mixed up, as a lot of the kingdoms in this area were. The other frontier zone is the Oxus Plain. Right up, you can see the Oxus River.
It should be there.
That is what became Bactria. That is again a frontier region. The other frontier region is northern Egypt and the upper Nile, with all the people from the eastern Mediterranean coming, and then this onrush from the Red Sea, which comes up to Egypt, which I'll talk about a little later. Indian sources refer to the Greeks as Yavanas. This is a derivation from Ionia, which became Ionia, which became Yona in Prakrit and became Yavana in Sanskrit. And the Yavanas are also sometimes referred to as Mlech, because they're kind of outsiders, they're foreigners, they're aliens, they're not one of us. Until, of course, they become one of us, then they cease to be called Mlech. But there it is. And what is the one crucial factor that is bringing all these people together and creating these distances? You'll be surprised to hear it's pepper. The pepper trade. Pepper, which is produced on the west coast of India, goes in vast quantities overland and by sea, all the way to Alexandria, from where it goes up to Rome. The pepper trade is extremely important, which is why it is sometimes brings in a lot of Roman coinage, which I'll also talk about later, and it's therefore sometimes referred to as black gold in the Shangam texts. It is a form of black gold. The degree to which the areas are Hellenized is indicated perhaps by some of the Ashokan edicts being found just south of Begram in the Kabul and Kandahar region, Kandahar particularly, in Greek, paraphrased, translated from Prakrit into Greek, written up as beautiful inscriptions on stone in Greek, and in Aramaic, which was the script and language that was used in Persia before the Greeks arrived. So what I'm trying to suggest is that, in a sense, these areas are not isolated areas where stray people come together and sort of set up a kingdom. These are areas which are in contact, and their culture is very much a culture that is talking one to the other, to the other, to the other. It's a continuity of dialogue and conversation that goes on from India through West Asia to the Eastern Mediterranean. An important aspect of this is urbanism. The Hellenistic conquests result in the setting up of Greek cities, the most famous of which is a city called Ichanum in Bactria. Not marked on the map.
It's there.
Well, there is. Yes, Alexander had this habit of setting up cities and calling them Alexandrias after him.
1, 2, 3,
everywhere he
4,
went. Once fed up of
5. There'll be lots.
Yeah, it's just scattered all around the place. But the interesting thing about these cities is that they're very often centers of what Naman's going to be talking about, Gandhara art. And that is important, the artistic remains that you find in these cities. So there are migrations going on, the invasions are largely over, the major invasions with Alexander. There are petty ones here and there, certainly. So pepper is being brought from India, and the other item, which is very expensive but very important, silk from China, which largely goes overland. There's some of it going by sea, but it's mainly overland. And the economic impact of this trade, which I will speak about a little later, is certainly there, but remember that it's pepper and textiles. Coming back, all kinds of interesting objects, like amphorae of Eastern Mediterranean wine, which the Indians absolutely adored. The Shangam texts are full of very happy descriptions of this lovely, warm wine which the Yavanas bring loaded on their ships. So those of you who think that Scotch whisky is the name of the game today, remember you have antecedents in the Greek wine. And coinage, punchmark coins of the Mauryas and Indo-Greek coins. Okay, I'll stop there now and I'll hand over to Naman, who will carry on with...
I'm going to amplify on some of the things that Romila has signaled for our attention, and to think about what happens to those societies once they migrate. What drives them to migrate? That's a tough question to answer. And when you're thinking about what they are lacking in their homes, that's compelling somebody to move. Why move? Why migrate? So if we're not talking about invasion, at least with invasion, you know why an invasion is taking place. You have a series of economic factors. But when we talk about migration, it becomes far more sophisticated and more delicate, the matter, because one needs to then get into a lot of psychological issues about why people want to stay in a particular land, what's attracting them to that place, and what's making them disenchanted with their homeland. Why do they want to leave that place? This brings us to a more contemporary term that we use nowadays, and we don't just talk about the influence of one culture or another and the migration, but we also talk about a word called transculturalism for that reason, because we want to look at person-to-person exchange that might have taken place, society to society, not happening only at the level of rulers, but also happening at the level of the population at large. Now, Romila just said that you have intermarriage, and she wants us to bear in mind the issue of what happens to the lingua franca, and how does language itself change? How do people become multilingual, at least bilingual, but sometimes multilingual in each of these cities that are created, all these many Alexandrias, after all, that attract Greek diasporas to come and live in them, must have had a multilingual urban population. So I was intrigued by this, and I've collected a few slides to share with you today, and I'm going to use them to pose certain questions. Now, this is a public sundial, one of two that was found in Ai-Khanum. It's been restored, it's been put together, and it's quite a fabulous object. It's got these lion's paws that make up its feet, and there would have been what we call a gnomon over there that would have cast its shadow, telling you the time. You all know how a sundial works, but bizarrely, this is a sundial that is calibrated to the angle of the sun in Egypt, at the Aswan, not calibrated to the angle of the sun in Afghanistan, where it was put up in the New Alexandria in Ai-Khanum. So then you start thinking about diasporas. What culture do diasporic communities uphold? At least Ai-Khanum's material, which is early Greek settler community material, gives us a different kind of clue about the nature of settling down in a new land. It's different from what we look at that happens 300 years later in the same area of Gandhar. Initially, in this period, we need to think about why the Greeks are leaving Greece. This is a time when they're being Latinized. This is a time when Rome has captured Greece, and Greece has been reduced to a colony. And when Greece itself has been reduced to a colony, the Greek intelligentsia is going to these many diasporic cities of Alexandria that have been created all over the world. Cleopatra, the Ptolemaic queen, gives Greeks the right of domicile, not citizenship, but domicile. The Parthians in Iran call themselves Philhellenic, friends of the Greeks. So that means they're open to having the Greeks come and live and reside in Iran. And in Ai-Khanum, where they come and settle in Bactria, they bring a lot of this Greek settler culture. But all this while, we'd been looking for connections between Greece and India, not realizing that these diasporic communities in the many Alexandrias were also networked. And so you get an Egyptian Greek identity, which is already a hybrid identity, mixing with an Afghan Greek identity, which is also a mixed identity. And so you're looking at multiple mixed identities meeting, and then you start looking at these ideas of memory, nostalgia, and bringing back ideas of your homeland, which you're keeping alive in a diasporic community. Now, for years as art historians, we've been battling as to why is it that in Roman times, when the art of the rest of the Mediterranean land is expressing Roman gods, why do we find Greek gods still being made in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD in South Asia, in Central Asia? And it's because diasporic communities sometimes hold on to the memory of a culture much longer, even though what's happening in their homeland has profoundly changed. And this is a very interesting experience of the memory of Greek culture living on. And so it's not exactly contemporary with what is going on with the latest fashions in the Mediterranean, but it's a new kind of Indo-Greek art that is developing. The other thing that we need to remember is that even when the Mediterranean, at the height of the Roman Empire, is Latinized, the language of trade from Arabia, from Alexandria, from Egypt, all the way through to India, remains Greek. And so we have Greek traders and Arab traders talking to the Latin traders on the Mediterranean. And so the linguistic shift really happens in Alexandria, where you get a more Latinate world that starts after that. So this is to look at, thinking about time and memory. I thought the sundial gives us something to think about. But the other thing that happens in Gandhara is this kind of a switch. Now here are two public statues that are put up clearly for making a statement to the world. The extraordinary image that you see on the left is not from the Trevi Fountain, I promise you. It's even though it looks like some kind of Roman pastiche, it was near Jalalabad. When you cross the Khyber, as soon as you cross the Khyber, you come to Jalalabad, and near Jalalabad there was Tepe Shotor, and at Tepe Shotor there were several grottos. And in one of the grottos, in one of the caves, there was a Buddha in the center, flanked by a statue of Hariti, not that Hariti, another Hariti, and a statue of Vajrapani, the Bodhisattva. Except they made their Vajrapani like Hercules. And this mixing of icons, of the image being simultaneously Hercules and simultaneously Vajrapani, is important, so that the Greek population and the settler population has a hook. But what is the hook that they are seeking? They are seeking a hook into Buddhist society. It's not a statue of Hercules. In the final analysis, this is a statue of Vajrapani. But it's a Vajrapani that is in the guise of, dressed up like, behaving like a Hercules. It's not the other way around. And the reason we know that, and I can say that with confidence, is because so much Gandharan art tends to show a certain requirement to adapt to and assimilate within Indian culture. And that starts happening by the 2nd century AD. So there's a shift that is happening in these Hellenistic cultures between their arrival in the 2nd century BC in the kind of imported object that they brought in, to the kind of new culture that they are adopting in the land in which they have settled. And nothing makes that more clear than this statue, which comes from Peshawar. It's a statue of Hariti. Hariti is a Buddhist mother goddess. And I've done detailed lectures about her, and you can probably watch them on YouTube. But the remarkable thing about this particular statue in the British Museum, it comes from Yusufzai, and Yusufzai is not far from Peshawar. I was able to identify the different children around Hariti. And that's a little Kartikeya, the son of Shiv and Parvati. That's Priyanka, her youngest child. That is a particular temple boy which we find in Phoenicia, in Cyprus, in Lebanon, in that part of the world. He's always placed in front of the shrine of Aphrodite, Demeter, and so on, exactly in that pose. These twin boys, are the Dioscuri, or what we in Latin call Gemini. And above that, with the boy with the finger on his lips, has a mohawk, like an Egyptian, and he is Harpocrates, the Egyptian child of Isis, the mother goddess Isis. So you've got, and then these two, I'm not absolutely sure who they are, but since all the other world's religions are there, the Greek, the Egyptian, the Hindu, the Phoenician, the Buddhist, the only one that's missing in the story is Zoroastrian, and this might be a reference to Amardad and Hordad, but perhaps. Now the interesting thing is, it means that this community in Peshawar needed a public statue that when the Zoroastrians would look at it, they'd say, oh yes, they can recognize Amardad and Hordad and say, that's the mother. The Hindus can look at her and say, oh yes, that's the mother goddess. And each of them has a hook into this one great Magna Mater statue, this great mother goddess called Hariti, who's welcoming all these diverse populations. She's placed outside a Buddhist monastery in Yusufzai, not inside in the sanctum, but at the gate. Hariti statues are placed at the entrance for the public to see, opposite a statue of Kuber. And it's performing a certain public function as a result. I think these kind of things about what is the nature of this public requirement made me begin to wonder that was there a certain anxiety about immigration and multiculturalism that needed to be assimilated and assuaged in some way? The second question that came to my mind was, who's calling the shots here? They are adopting and adapting to a Buddhist iconographic system in those cities. And so I began to ask that were Indians intransigent or unaccepting of these Yavanas? Were they, as Romila said initially, all dismissed as mlech? And if they were, when did their status change? How long did acculturation take? How long does it take for a community to become accepted as being a settler community that belongs to that place rather than be considered outsiders? What does it take to be assimilated? And I think we get a few very interesting clues, and I'm going to read out a couple of lines. The 4th century text, like the Jain Prakrit Angavijja, clubs Yavanas along with Dravidas and Mundas as mlech, of mixed caste. In the Mahabharata, there's a concocted story for an indigenous origin because they say that they might have descended from Yayati on the one hand or from the holy cow of Vashishth. In the Dharma Shastras, there is a definite increase in the number of mixed castes who could not be left out of consideration of the Indian social fabric. So if the number of castes, mixed castes, was 11 in the Gautama Dharma Shastra, it becomes 14 in the Bodhayan Dharma Shastra, and by the time of the Manusmriti, in the 6th or 5th century AD, there were 61 Mishra Jatis, right? So there were, Manu admits 61 mixed castes with Yavana mixing. And that's quite a large number. So over a 1,000-year period, we've got that many more categories of assimilation in the texts that have come up. I think we need to start asking more of these kinds of questions when we look at the art history of this period, rather than just celebrate it as a kind of a bonhomie of mixing of cultures and as if there were no anxieties at that time, but try and look at them very carefully and date them and see what's the difference between the Gandharan art of the 3rd century or 2nd century BC, and how is it different from what's happening in the 2nd and 3rd century AD? And is there a shift in the nature of the assimilation that has taken place in that society? And I think with careful attention, it's possible to do that. The other thing that Romila asked us to look at, and I'm quite keen to do, is not just what's happening in the public sphere, but also to talk about what's happening on the personal sphere. Individual items. Now here is a cameo that is made out of probably sardonyx, and in its extraordinary object that was found in Bannu, in Accra. And it shows a lion's head as a hoodie on top of Hercules' head. It's a large cameo. It's a fabulous jewel that was obviously owned by somebody in Bannu in about the 2nd century AD, perhaps as late as that. At the same time, you get this extraordinary ring, which has this fabulous setting with Indian diamonds that is being used. Now, Golconda is the only ancient source for diamonds, and that's being used by somebody in the Roman Empire. And I threw in these two things for Romila's benefit, because I've always admired the rings that she has on her fingers. And I thought that, well, maybe I can show you a ring that you don't have in your collection.
Agree to that.
So there is a certain kind of a person-to-person exchange of things that people are trading and holding on to, which show the requirement of the kind of things they are trading and the kind of things that they desire from another culture, that they want to hold on to. And is it just an object? Or is it a carrier of meaning? Is it telling us much more than just an object of luxury? Or is it a memory? Is it a contact with another civilization? Wearing a Hercules cameo in Bannu is making a statement. And you're adopting a religious icon on your body, on your personhood. And that has a certain carrier of meaning for that person who wore that jewel. In the same way, another term that we often use when we come into a slightly later period, which is the Latinate period, which is the Roman period, we make a terrible mistake. We keep calling it Rome and India. Which India? Which Indian? I say this not just because of the fluidity of the boundaries that Romila mentioned, but is it a person who is a Tamil speaker, or are we talking about somebody who is a Gandhari speaker, or are we talking about somebody who is speaking any of the other different dialects in between all the boundaries of South, or in between the entire region of South Asia? And what do we mean by when we say Roman at this time? Since the Roman Empire, which we showed you on the map earlier, spreads all the way from Hadrian's Wall through most of Europe and coming into Turkey and Syria, then really what do we mean by Roman at this time? And so it's not just an exchange between Rome and India, but you're talking about the many Romans and the many Indians who are also the many Jews and Greeks and Arabs and Buddhists and Hindus and even those who worship Isis and Mithras, and they're all engaging with each other, right? And they are, this is what we need to keep in mind, The second thing we need to keep in mind in all of this is that Roman provinces are more than being provinces or colonies of Rome. Now we need to understand this a little bit. There's an identity of Greek culture, which is a very strong Greek identity, which has always existed. And even when they are Romanized, is there a complete separation and a forgetting of their Greek identity? Does Egypt forget its Ptolemaic and Egyptian identity? Do lands like Syria become Romanized? But what happens to their prior Syrian identity? The reason I mention this is that these provinces had agency, they had their own culture, and provinces were engaging with other provinces, if we want to use that word. But places like Gandhara and Muziris and Kolhapur, where I'll show you some objects from in a minute, were not even provinces of Rome. They were never under Roman contact, and yet they had exchanges with Egypt. And so we mustn't forget the role of the mediators, the intermediaries in this Indo-Roman trade that was going on. It wasn't just a case of the fabulous things that are found in Rome or in Pompeii, but it's about what is happening in Britain and what's happening in Gaul and in Germania and what's happening in Dacia and what's happening in Egyptum, and what's happening in each of these places is equally important because they have their own agency. So porphyry, for instance, becomes all the fashion at this time as a stone. Now, Indians have enough beautiful quarries of stone of their own, but they're fascinated because this is the age where the great cachet for all the Roman emperors is to have their faces and their bodies made out of porphyry. And porphyry is a stone that is found in Upper Egypt. It's also been traded and brought to Afghanistan, to Begram, where this beautiful beaker and another vessel were found made of porphyry. Yeah. Or the god Serapis. Now, Serapis is a particularly Roman period export. He's a Hellenistic Ptolemaic deity of the underworld and of healing, but he ends up becoming a deity that is exported all over through the agencies of empire. And as Roman soldiers and traders go from place to place, they take these little statuettes, these little tumblers, these little cameos, these individually owned objects, and they are sold to individuals in the other side, at the other side. And they become personal treasures. And this person-to-person exchange leads to something fantastic. It leads to a learning of the other's culture. So when we see something like this extraordinary Indian statuette made of ivory that was found under the debris of ash at Pompeii, which means that it had reached Pompeii before Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD. And it's found in a house with a lovely garden as one of the objects in this person's house. You begin to wonder, why did this person want to own this Satavahana-style ivory statuette in his home? What did he think of it? What did they imagine they had? Did they know it was a yakshi? Did they know that in Indian aesthetic systems by this time, there is a certain kind of naika called a darpanika, who looks in a mirror, who plays with her earring because she is lost in reverie and she's in love? And this is a particular Indian kind of object, Indian aesthetic system. And what was the family in Kolhapur thinking when they were importing an erotic iconographic system from the Roman world over here, which you see on the other side, where you see Perseus and Andromeda embracing as they are reaching towards each other. And you see this little bronze emblem, only that big, which lies in the Kolhapur town hall. If you ever go to Maharashtra, please go and see it in the Kolhapur town halls. And it's an extraordinary little object that was found in a hoard of small bronzes that were personally owned. And I like to compare these because they're sort of like for like. It's just as an Indian family is getting to become acquainted with Greek systems of aesthetic, Roman systems of aesthetics and love stories and mythology, so too is a Roman family at the same time learning about an Indian set of ideas. So I'm going to leave it there and leave it for you to carry on, and then I'll bite back in with some other images.
I have a little postscript to what you were saying. One is the lady found at Pompeii. Was it perhaps some very daring Indian trader who made his way from Alexandria to Rome and visited Pompeii, and happened to be sitting with the 2 or 3 little bits and pieces, and suddenly the whole thing ascended?
Well, actually, they say, Pliny says that they had run out of ivory from any other source except India, and they were importing vast amounts of ivory from India. And the Jataka stories come up making a lot about how unfortunate it is that elephants have to be hacked. And there is a story in the Jataka stories, which is on the side of the elephants as the great lovely animals, and the Bodhisattva is the elephant, and how Chedanta says, all right, take away my extra tusks, but leave my friends, leave my family, don't take their tusks. So I think ivory trade at this time is quite a big thing, and many, many millions of elephants, or thousands of elephants at least, were being hacked. And it's also happening at a time when there's massive deforestation of India.
Yeah.
You know?
So it's just possible that there was an Indian trader who
is trading in ivory.
Anyway,
yeah.
But the other point, which I think is very important, and which both you and I have missed out on, which is that when 2 cultures come together, you have one culture, and then there is another culture that comes in, and so there's an amalgamation. It's not always as we were brought up to believe 50 years ago when I first studied history, that it's X influencing Y. Actually, today you sit and think about what was the new culture that evolved out of this intermixture. And that's a totally different story from just talking about this culture influencing this culture, or this happening and they take on the characteristics of this, that, and the other, because there's something new that's happening. There's a new cultural evolution, and that, I think, is very important and changes certainly some of our attitudes to looking at history. You don't think of it merely in terms of they came, the migration came, the migrants came, and they settled down and they changed whatever culture the local culture was. Because you're now talking about they come in and settle down, changes take place, and a new culture evolves. And one thinks of this particularly in relation to belief systems, which are very vulnerable. Belief systems, however strongly you may hold them, and however strongly their perpetrators or propagators and so on talk about them, religions. When 2 belief systems come together and begin to integrate, what emerges is not just the influence of one on the other. What emerges is a new belief system, and that advances that religion a little further as you go along. Anyway, this is a subject that I could talk about endlessly, because I'm very committed to the notion of the evolution of new cultures from the acculturation or confrontation or acceptance of one culture by another, or how they mix. What is the nature of the mixture, and what is the nature of what comes out of that mixture? It's like cooking a belief system. cooking a new belief system. And I think that's a very important way of looking at belief and practice and so on, which we haven't really properly investigated. But to get back, and then now we're on to the Roman trade proper. What came to be referred to as the trade between Rome and India, and as you rightly said, it's not Rome and India, it's particular aspects of it, it really comes about and reaches a peak point between about 100 BC and 200 AD. That's the turn of the Christian era, as it were, which is the peak point of this trade. And when I say the peak point, I mean it's the maximum amount of the pepper that is imported and that is paid for in gold and silver coinage. This happens during the reign of Augustus and carries on a little further. Please keep in mind that Rome is undergoing its own change and evolution, and the beginning of the Roman Empire is being established. And it happens to coincide with this trade. No one's really looked at whether the trade had anything to do with helping or assisting this process of change, but that's a question that awaits attention. Then there's all this very romantic story of Antony and Cleopatra that we're all familiar with and are so fond of and so on. Keep in mind that Cleopatra is important because she's beautiful, she's attractive, she's got all the qualities that Antony is looking forward to and wishing to have in his hands when he meets the ideal woman, etc., etc., etc. But remember, there's also the trade going on, and Egypt is crucial to that trade. So it's a romance, it's a perfectly legitimate romance, it's a romance that we all enjoy reading about, thinking about, etc., etc. But at the same time, don't forget that there is a very mundane dimension comparatively to the romance, which is trade and the role that Egypt is playing and how important it is for Rome economically to control that trade through Egypt. Because the maximum amount of activity that is going on is in that little bit of northern Egypt, the land relations, the bit that was called the Suez. There was no canal, of course, but it was an area that was crucial to communication between the Red Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. The journey from India of the cargo and the trade and the people that went with it, let's not forget that these were ships that were going 120 ships every year, full of sailors, navigators, and other people who arrived, and the cargo was being transferred, just taken away, and there was fresh cargo being brought on, and so on. So there's a lot of presence of these Yamana traders who may not have been Romans, could have been Eastern Mediterranean, Egyptian, people from the southern Arabian shores, and so on. But nevertheless, there are these people milling around with trade. The trade is not just limited to Indians. This is the point that I'm trying to get at. This particular trade is a trade which attracts all kinds of people that come and are connected with the trade. So it starts, can we have the math?
Yeah.
Let's say we start with South India, Osiris, which is present-day Putnam is thought to be Osiris. There's a debate about it. Starts with Osiris. And the first lap of the trade is sea trade, Osiris to Socotra. And Socotra is a fascinating island if you ever want to go there, because it's got caves that are absolutely covered with engravings in the Brahmi script and occasionally other scripts, but mainly Brahmi, giving the names of the people who stopped off in Socotra. Short of saying, I'm very bored by this and my name is whatever it is, It's just the name that's there. But Socotra is fascinating from that point of view.
But what also, sorry if I may interrupt for a second, the inscriptions, some of them are in Brahmi, revealing the identity. Most of them are in Tamil Brahmi, but some of them are in Gandhari Brahmi.
No.
And so it means that there are traders who are going from Western Punjab and Afghanistan, also on the sea trade, just as they are Peninsula Indians on that sea trade. So it's not a matter that Gandhara is only on the land route.
No.
Sorry.
Okay, so that's the first lap, Osiris to Socotra. Then Socotra, it continues and it goes through this little gap along the Red Sea, and there are a whole lot of ports along the western shores of the Red Sea, which are ports and trading centers from which some of the sculpture comes and various other objects come. Mixed objects of subjects that are both Indian, broadly Indian, and subjects are mainly Buddhist, interestingly, and subjects that are Hellenistic, for lack of another word, all the way there. Myos, Hormos, and Berenike are two major port sites in this, and from there the cargo is loaded onto land animals, and it's taken to Coptos, then it goes down the Nile to Alexandria. So this is another different kind of, from the sea trade, it changes to land trade, it changes to river trade, and it arrives in Alexandria. And Alexandria, the merchants are in direct touch with Rome. And there they're sorting out things, and there's a lot of skullduggery going on. And there are complaints about the fact that the merchants of Alexandria cannot be trusted, and they're putting in poppy seeds where they should be putting in pepper and that kind of thing. They're very dishonest, but they're making masses and masses of money. Anyway, there the cargo is taken from Alexandria up to Rome. So it's right, it's a complicated business. It's not Osiris to Rome direct trade on one ship and it all just goes all the way through. It's constantly packing, unpacking cargo, putting it onto ships, putting it onto animals, putting it back onto ships, and so on. Just not easy to do. But anyway, so it's by sea, it's coastal, it's overland, and low. The actual travel, which was, of course, very, very hazardous until a certain point, and there's a constant complaint about shipwrecks. Constantly, cargo is lost because it's wrecked. And then suddenly it changes. It changes because they discover the southwest monsoon. And the southwest monsoon, can we go back?
Oh, we want to go back to the right.
Sorry. And the southwest monsoon means that the ships line up from Ochelis to Socotra, 120 Roman ships that have come down from Coptos and the northern Red Sea, Egypt, all the way down the Red Sea to Ochelis. They line up there, and as soon as the monsoon turns and the winds start blowing up to the Indian peninsula, the ships sail happily, and it only takes them 14 days, whereas earlier it took something like 2 months to slowly plow their way through the Arabian Sea. And they arrive, so there are ports not only along the Red Sea, there are ports along the southern Arabian coast and across into the Indus Delta, which is virtually closed to navigation by now, down to Bari Gaza, which is a very famous big port, Porochte, and down the west coast, with a series of settlements of the strait down the west coast all the way to Osiris. So it's a very, very active Arabian Sea. It's just bubbling with energy and rushing here and doing things and getting things together and so on. The trade is very active. why is a trade so important and so, in a sense, overblowing everything else? It's pepper after all, but it's pepper that doesn't require much effort as far as cultivation goes. That pepper vines grow almost naturally. And the place, Kerala, is just crowded with pepper. And the pepper is being paid for in Roman coins of gold and silver. It's a very solid trade. It's a trade which I must confess that when I first started looking at the data a little bit, I thought to myself, good Lord, what did they do with these coins? Superb, beautiful gold coins, silver coins, which are being found in hoards in South India. And it's the pepper trade. And the pepper trade plays a very important role because after these southwest monsoon winds have blown the ships from Socotra towards the Indian peninsula, the return journey is 3 months later, which again is the northeast monsoon, which comes from the peninsula across the Arabian Sea to Socotra. So the interesting thing is, of course, to keep in mind the fact that you've got 120 shiploads of sailors and oddments and traders and merchants and so on, sitting in Socotra, then sailing across to the peninsula, distributing themselves to varying trading centers and ports and towns, sitting and waiting for 3 months, packing the fresh cargo of pepper and then taking it back to Socotra and up the Red Sea. So you have a big presence of non-Indian navigators and sailors who are indulging in this pepper trade and minting money. They're obviously the middlemen of this trade, whether it is what the Indian sources call the Yavanas, or whether it is the Indians, they're all minting money. What do they do with the money? This is a question that we historians are still battling over. We haven't been able to solve it quite. There's all the money, all these wads of coins that come. There are a few coins that have been overstamped, a few coins that have got holes in them, meaning that they were worn as necklaces or some kind of decoration or something. But the majority are intact, and they're not worn out, so they're not being in circulation very much. They've been kept as was. And the question, of course, is, what did they do with these coins? What did they understand about these coins that kept them hoarding them rather than using them to the point where they would be completely worn out? Anyway, that's... and at the same time, as you have the pepper going out and the silk coming from the north to some of the ports going out, so on, together with various other things, you have coming in more and more at this time amphorae of wine, amphorae that also carried a certain amount of olive oil and something called garum, which is a kind of fish paste that the Yavanas absolutely adored and the Indians couldn't stand. So the fish paste was all eaten by the Yavanas.
I have a slide here of these.
Oh, the amphorae, yeah.
The amphorae.
Absolutely. Rather beautiful objects, I must say, but you can see what's happening. There were other items also that went with the pepper, but to a very small quantity, and these were things like indigo and lac dyes. The Romans loved indigo dyes and were constantly using them. Some cotton textiles too, sandalwood, the perfume, teak, the quality of the wood, and ebony, the quality of the wood. Gemstones such as agate and carnelian. Carnelian is an absolute signature of the presence of Indians. Wherever they went, there was carnelian that traveled with them as gemstones, and they carved on them, and they cut them, and they put them into jewelry, that kind of thing. So that was there. Carvings in ivory, as Naman has mentioned, and rather surprisingly, imported into Rome were live birds and animals. Peacocks. They loved peacocks. And animals, tigers, elephants of course, and monkeys.
Yeah.
One just has visions of these large ships traveling with all this cargo and having monkeys leaping around and having tigers growling and elephants and what have you. The items come into India and go out of India in large quantities, found in the ports and displayed as objects. And some rather beautiful intaglios, carvings. Recently found one in Pattanam was a sphinx-type figure, not quite the Egyptian sphinx, but a sphinx-type figure, made out of agate, which was obviously used as an object of trade.
Well, these are some of those amphorae. So when these ships would come across to India, the hold of the ship that's underwater would be weighted down with these amphorae that were stacked with, we imagine, Southern Italian wine or Greek wine, or maybe...
Wine from the Greek islands.
Yeah, from the islands.
Yeah.
And the fabric, the clay fabric of the amphorae, more than 17,000 shards of pottery have been found in peninsular India, which are all from these torpedo vases and these amphorae. And for those of you who are interested in archaeology, there are entire classification systems of different kinds of amphorae where we know which were the main production centers for making which kinds of bottles. And by doing a petrographic analysis, they've been able to reconstruct the 5 or 6 major sites which were producing the ceramic ware. And it's the wine from those places that was coming into South India. And all of these amphorae are of a particular kind. Now, in the rest of the Roman Empire, they were using other kinds of amphorae, but the ones that were coming to India are a particular category and a particular type that were obviously well suited for the holds of these large ships that were coming across at that time, as Romila explained, during the monsoon wind, going across from Socotra to Muziris or to Arikamedu. Now, the earliest major discovery of these was by Mortimer Wheeler and the excavations of Arikamedu. But ever since then, which is in Tamil Nadu, near Pondicherry, but ever since then, we found these amphorae in a number of other sites. And they're scattered all along the coasts, both coasts, Arabian Sea as well as Bay of Bengal. So the ships would come laden with this wine and oil and fish paste, and they would leave with jewels, textiles, and of course the hold will be filled with pepper instead. Is it any wonder then that the Indian horde, which had that Perseus and Andromeda, the Indian trader also had a little god of the sea, Neptune or Poseidon, kept in his sacred belongings? How appropriate, isn't it? I mean, I don't think it's surprising at all. It's the one kind of charm or personal idol that somebody who is a trader who is crossing the sea might want to hold on to. It's at the same time that in Paithan, in Maharashtra, we get these Roman objects, Roman terracottas. Now, a Roman terracotta, this is not a valuable object. This is not an expensive luxury item like that bronze statuette or those jewels that were being traded. But the presence of a Roman figure in the terracotta means that during those 3 to 4 months when the Romans are, those traders are living in peninsular India, they're not sitting only trading. There are other things that are happening. And there is an integration of cultures that is taking place, because the fabric analysis of these clay figurines shows that they are made out of Indian clay, but they're made in the Alexandrian technique, and they're dipped in a white slip and then baked. And except, of course, the white slip doesn't mature because they don't have kilns that can go up to the temperature of kaolin. And the white slip therefore washes off most of these things, but the terracotta core of the object is well fired. And so they're imitating Roman, Egyptian ceramic ware in India during that time. And I think this is also quite interesting because there's a transference of technologies that is taking place. Now, lest you have got a picture where you feel that Western religious figures are mixing with Indian religious figures, what happens the other way around? How do Indian religious figures impact the Western imagination? That's another question that needs to be asked. If there's so much trade, what are the Indian traders doing for the 6 months of the year when they're living in Berenike? And that makes us wonder, what were they up to while they were there? And that's really one of my last images. I mean, the rest are not germane to what we are talking about today. But these are some very new discoveries that have only happened in the past few years. And they were found at the port of Berenike. The Polish archaeology mission has been excavating there. And they found a courtyard which had multiple shrines, including one that was a shrine to the Buddha and Bodhisattva, with an inscription that identified Maitreya over there. And it's quite a remarkable Greek Parian marble statue. It's not Indian stone, it's Greek stone that's been used to carve a Buddha. And that is quite a remarkable thing, because you're getting an exchange at the very early period in the 1st, 2nd centuries, just when the Buddha image has only just been invented, that it's already there. And that means that there are these enclaves of Buddhists who are talking to those who are followers of Mitra. And there must have been perhaps some very early Christians who might have recently become Christian, perhaps living in Egypt, northern Egypt at that time. They might have just about been the earliest Christians that might have been in their midst at that time, who they might have engaged with. And I think there's something remarkable in this statue, because when you look at it first, you say, are these Indians who are going from Gandhara, or are these Indians who are going from Amaravati or Panigiri? What kind of a Buddha is this? Is this a Mathura Buddha? Is this a Gandhara Buddha? It's a Berenike Buddha. It's another style of Buddha. It's got its own localized identity. And just as we look at statues of Hercules in India, which are neither very Roman nor very Greek, but there's something quite mixed up about it, and that's exactly what we are getting with the stylistic nature of this particular Buddha statue that's being made in northern Egypt at that time. And I think what also needs to be seen is, alongside, nearby, also found at Berenike, was this Vrishni triad. And very few people have seen this. And this is quite important for those of you who know the history of Vaishnavism, or Bhagavatism, as we should correctly call it, at this time. There was Balaram, Ekanamsa, and Vasudev. And Vasudev will later become Krishna. And so it's a very early 1st century BC image of the triad of the Vrishnis, of the early Bhagavat cult, also over there in Berenike. So I think it's not just public statuary that we're looking at in Gandhara and in Peshawar,
But I also wanted to signal this thing about public statuary that might be, in that part of the world, being used perhaps initially by the Indian traders over there, but then later on also just a shrine for the other 6 months of the year that those people are engaging with. And so one needs to think about this two-way exchange and this process of acculturation, which I thought I'd try and bring to life when carrying on.
Okay. To go back a little bit to the actual nitty-gritty of the Roman trade, the interest begins with the excavation of the place that Dhawan mentioned, Arikamedu, near Pondicherry, which was done by Mortimer Wheeler rather flimsily in the late 1940s, and then left alone. It was realized that there was some kind of Greco-Roman contact, but that was in the early days. They didn't know very much. The site was then very carefully and meticulously excavated about 40 years later, 30 years later, and there is a report, a detailed excavation report, which does suggest more extensive finds of objects involved in this trade. And then, of course, after that, you had a number of other sites. So currently, the work that is being done at Pattanam is really quite extraordinary in terms of what it is producing of objects of various kinds. The post-Mauryan period is an interesting period because there's not been too much trade going on at that point. The Mauryas and the Seleucids and the Greeks were interested in political and diplomatic connections, and they were busy establishing these and didn't care so much. It was not that trade or economy was neglected, but it was not centrally important as it was to become later on. And, for example, as it was to become with the Shakas and the Kushans and so on in the early centuries AD, turn of the Christian era again. There is some interesting evidence, but much more needs to be collected about the economies of the trade, which I think are worth keeping in mind. It's been calculated that one consignment from Muziris, that's Pattanam, consisted of 1,700 pounds of spices, 4,700 pounds of ivory, raw ivory to be cut, and 800 pounds of weight of textiles. This is not counting the black pepper, which was a huge consignment, much larger than any of these. So we're really talking about fairly big-time trade. And I think that the more work that is done on this, on the economy of that trade, and the size of the trade, would help us to come to realize how important and significant it was. It was not just a little flutter of Greco-Roman, Indian, and what have you. The largest quantity, of course, was black pepper, which ripened at the close of the monsoon and was ready to be picked and packed and taken back with the northeast monsoon. And the purchase, as I said before, was in good Roman coinage of gold and silver. It was a large capital investment. This is something that the economic historians keep talking about, but we don't get too far beyond saying what that large capital investment might have done to the economy of the ports, for example, that were involved in this trade, leave alone the economy of Rome or the economy of parts of India. The cargo was large, the crew that came with the ships was large, and there was a tremendous need for insurance against piracy, because the piracy in the Arabian Sea was dreadful and dreaded. So that was something else that required a lot of money and paying off, as it were. What is not clear is the role of the coins in the economy. This certainly needs much more work. Were they simply hoarded and slowly sold? We're also told that the bullion value of the gold coin is much more than the actual value of the coin. So it's thought that possibly some of the coins would have been sold as bullion. Sold to whom, sold where, what is the evidence for this? We don't have that fully as yet. We have people like Pliny the Elder in Rome complaining bitterly about how much this trade with India and China has cost the Roman economy. Roman patrician women are particularly his target of attack. These women who insist on wearing silk and insist on having delicate spices and having their food cooked with exotic spices, they're the ones that are the cause of all this drain of money out of Rome towards Central Asia for the silk and pepper, South India for the pepper. So there we are. In all of this, around the turn of the Christian era, the beginning of the centuries AD, one of the most interesting areas involved in this trade is the Western Deccan, the coast of Maharashtra, where the Greco-Roman cultures did host another dimension of what is in part a kind of outlet, a kind of suggestion of what the trade did and how it did. I'm talking about the Satavahana period and the Satavahanas as a population, as settlers in these towns, as people who had an economy that was worthwhile. What was so important? If you go do a trip down the west coast of Maharashtra, which is certainly something that you should do, there are a series of Buddhist caves that are visible and really quite well maintained even to this day. Places like Karle, Nasik, Junar, Sopara have been the basis of a huge development of monastic Buddhism and Buddhism that was tied up with the construction of halls of worship, chaityas, and so on. It's a vibrant, bubbling religious system that is taking place in this Western Deccan area of the South Continent. And the date of the sculptures and the inscriptions, and the massive number of inscriptions at these sites, is all 1st century BC to 1st century AD, which fits in with the Roman interest. The donors, quite often, not all together, but quite often, the donors identify themselves as Yavanas, but they all have Indian names. Indra Agnidatta, Dhammadeya, Bhutapala. These are not Yavana names, these are solid Indian names. So, why do they call themselves Yavanas? Is it these Yavanas, Westerners, Greco-Roman types from the Eastern Mediterranean who come with the trade, spend time in the Western Deccan, in a center which is absolutely dedicated to Buddhism, and get converted to Buddhism and take Indian names? This is something we have to think about. Some of the wealthier traders were certainly of Western origin because they list all the donations that they make. And their donations are frequently the making of a very large pillar with all the sculpture around the pillar, and the making of cisterns which water cisterns, but which nevertheless had low relief sculpture on the sides, and some of the wealthier ones donated halls to the monastery. So a number of viharas, monastic centers, and chaityas, halls, have been found amongst these caves in the Deccan. And the Tamil literature at this time begins to refer to Yavanas doing all kinds of jobs as craftsmen, as handymen, as people handling what is going on. The argument has also been made, and it's a very strong argument, that Buddhist monasteries and Buddhist monks were involved in the trade. They actually invested money in the trade, they made profits, they put that money back into those investments. They are, for all practical purposes, not the same level or same degree as the Indian traders, but a pretty good second. So this is part of the reason why you have these very lavish monasteries cut into the rock. And why do they cut them into the rock in the Deccan? That's another interesting question. I was discussing this with a geologist friend who said that the geology of the Deccan, the Western Deccan in the coast of Maharashtra, is what is called the Deccan Trap. It's volcanic rock that comes and falls in layers of lava, one layer on top of the other and so on. Therefore, when you're cutting, it's much easier. You just cut straight into these layers and pull out the rock. Now, whether this is so or not is another matter, but it's something that needs to be looked at. So we have this presence of Buddhist monks who are also indulging in the trade. And this brings me back to the question of, when two cultures meet and they begin to change each other, what is this third culture that emerges? Is it the same? Is it different? And interesting as a counterpart to this, there's also mention of a temple that was built to Augustus, the emperor, near the site of Muziris, which temple was still in use for years and years, so on. That's one side of the picture. The other side of the picture is in Brahmanical sources. The Buddhist sources are full of the Yavanas. They're quite happy with them, and they say nice things about them, and this, that, and the other. The Brahmanical sources keep referring to a category that they call Kala Yavana, the awful Yavanas, the bitter, the terrible Yavanas, the black Yavanas. And they are the Yavanas who are predicted as monsters, as demons, who go around killing people and doing all kinds of destructive things. So one has to ask, this is mythology. It occurs as a myth, the myth of the Kala Yavana occurs in the Mahabharata, it occurs in the Vishnu Puran as well. Long mythological stories about how the leading Kala Yavana is actually burned to ashes by one of the deities, one of the major deities of the Vaishnava tradition, etc. So the question that the historian has to ask is, what is the meaning of this myth? It's a fantasy, it's a myth. The Kala Yavanas didn't exist. There were no black Yavanas as such. At least we don't know. There don't seem to be any black Yavanas. But there are also other Yavanas who are not called Kala Yavanas because they are Vaishnavas. There's a very famous inscription of Heliodorus, who was the ambassador from Taxila of a Greek king to Ujjain. And he puts up this inscription saying, I am a Vaishnava and I worship Vasudeva, and so on and so forth. Then there is also that lovely book, in fact, called the Milinda Panaha, which is a Buddhist monk, Nagasena, who has a long and detailed conversation with a king called Menander, who was a well-known Indo-Greek king, in which he finally sort of converts Menander to Buddhism. The king is so interested that he's virtually converted. So what I'm trying to say is that you don't have these things happening only over trade, and you don't have them happening only over crews of ships going. There's another dimension of people coming and settling, people talking about their belief systems, and people taking up the belief systems of where they settle. Now, what happens to Buddhism in all of this? Not all of Buddhism, but the local Buddhism that was practiced in that area. Is there any impact of a new way of thinking? What happens to the cult of Vasudeva in that area? Is there any new way of thinking? This is again something that we have still to discover. Over to you, Naman.
Well, I have nothing really to add. I'm very happy to open it up if people have questions, and if there's anything that they want to talk about. I had one last picture that I thought I could show everyone. This was a photograph taken in colonial times, and it's taken at Lorient Tangai. And today, we are sitting here, you and I, as historians and art historians and archaeologists and museum people, and we're looking at these things. Now, this is the last time they were all together at that site. Ever since then, these have become museum objects that are now scattered all over the world. And this period of art history and history has become a kind of a signature in some way of multiculturalism. Whenever we want to talk about migrations and multiculturalism, we always talk about this particular period. And I always talk about this photograph in relation to that, because everyone wants a piece of this pie. Everyone knows that this is a great moment of intercultural mixing, and every museum in the world wanted one of these objects. And so now when you look at this photograph of all these convicts, as it were, lined up, from at Lorient Tangai, and now one's in Calcutta, one's in Delhi, one's in Chandigarh, one's in Swat, one's in Peshawar, one's in Takshila. Many are in the British Museum, some are in American Museum, some are somewhere, some are somewhere. And they've all gone all over the world now, because everyone knew that it was a moment of their history that they were linking it with. And it's a culture that was born of all these different societies coming together. And now today, it's a culture that every museum wants to own to be able to show how they were all part of an interconnected world. The same objects are now performing a different role for the world and the audience today.
I'll conclude with just a couple of things. One is something that bothers me and has intrigued me for a long time. You've got some very strong cultures expressing themselves in Sanskrit and Prakrit, and expressing themselves in Greek. And they're meeting, and they're being together, they're acculturating, they're getting to know each other, etc., etc. There's a lot of commonality going on amongst them. The Greeks are extremely curious. They can't stop themselves. They're rushing out. They're sending out people to India constantly, writing accounts of what they've seen, where they've been, what they've seen, who they talk to, what are these strange fantasies that everybody talks about. Men in India who have ears that are so long that they can curl up and sleep in them at night. Things like that. Fantasies. But at the same time, curiosity. Immense curiosity. Not a squeak from any Indian. Indians go all over the place and go and see people stay. As I said, there's no shortage of the presence of an Indian. It's invisible, it's inaudible. There isn't a single text from any Indian that says, I went to Egypt, I went to Alexandria, I may have even gone to Pompeii and witnessed this terrible eruption. Not a single word. And this is not just with relation to Rome, it's right through Indian history. Everybody from outside is coming and writing about the Indians at great length, in great detail, rightly, wrongly, fantasy, truth, everything. But there isn't a single Indian account of an Indian going out of India and going and living with people unfamiliar, but saying, this is what I saw, this is what I experienced. That needs some consideration. So what we've been talking about is the opening up geographically, as I said, of new areas, new ports, new towns, new settlements, people migrating, new cultures, new ways of looking at life, new ways of thinking, new belief systems. It must have been a very exciting world. And I often think that it might have been great fun to be living in Bucyrus or in Alexandria, not Rome, but Bucyrus or Alexandria, or even Iconographies. Very nice. One could travel there, certainly. But you do get from these sources and texts the feeling that something is bubbling, something is happening, and that's a very nice feeling, and a particularly nice feeling for a historian, because we're often completely swamped by rather dull accounts of what was going on at that time. But let me end with one statement which has always been a source of tremendous amusement. I happened quite by accident to come across an essay that I wrote, I think about, must have been 50 years ago, on precisely this, Rome and India, which I forgot I had written until I saw it this morning. And I started thumbing through it. And yes, the Indo-Roman trade declined after about the 3rd century AD, became much less and finally declined because the Romans got, or the people that were the successors of the Romans got interested in other things. You had Byzantium and whatnot, and you had Egypt interested in converting to Islam, interested in that, Indians interested in Southeast Asia, and there was a diversity of interests. Looking back at Rome in this period, it strikes one that it really must have been, despite my saying I wouldn't have liked to live there too much, it must have been a tremendously exciting city with all this going on, and in fact, all of this. It was attractive, it attracted people, it probably attracted immense numbers of tourists, and that kind of thing. And there was a lot of activity going on with people coming and going, and some people dissenting and being chased out and hiding, and others coming to power and asserting the power of the Roman Empire. And looking at the descriptions of Rome, I was reminded by a friend of mine who is or was a Roman historian, and who knew the Latin text very well, that there is a long description of Rome, off and on, made in a book which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, a very attractive book, the Book of Revelations according to St. John, which is part of the Bible, and it talks about this man who had a very exotic mind and a very rich mind, and he nurtured his mind and had all of these ideas. And what does he say? He describes Rome, and he is using cryptic language, because remember, this is being written at a time when Christianity has come to power. Rome is very important, the Vatican is beginning to be put together, and that kind of thing. And he describes Rome and calls it something which I've never forgotten. He calls it the Scarlet Harlot. I'll end.